I'm Amy Hutsell, the Director of Special Projects and Partnerships with Georgia's Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, or CJCC as we're known. And I'm here today with two of our human trafficking team to discuss the issue of human trafficking in Georgia. Erica Atzenhoffer is our Director, Supervisor of the Human Trafficking Unit at CJCC, and Sarah Pederson is our statewide SANE coordinator. Erica, do you want to talk a little bit briefly about your background and what you do in your role as the Human Trafficking Unit Supervisor?
Sure. So my background is predominantly in victim services. For several years before coming to CJCC, I worked at a child advocacy and sexual assault center in Athens, Georgia. I oversaw their adult services program. So that looked like providing advocacy, helping survivors of sexual abuse and sexual assault through the criminal and legal system, providing them advocacy through forensic medical exams, which Sarah will talk a little bit more about later on. And then I also oversaw a team of advocates that assisted with night and weekend call, assisting survivors of sexual assault and sexual abuse. And we also did some individual and group therapy. So that is a little bit of my background prior to joining the state. And then since being with CJCC for the last 7 years, I've had the opportunity to do some of that, continue in direct service, but also coordinating special projects and overseeing our human trafficking statewide task force. And so, yeah, plugging in, overseeing, and helping out with my unit and my team, making sure that we are out in the community doing trainings and public outreach with the community at large, as well as law enforcement, prosecution, victim service providers. We do quite a few things.
And you're doing very well.
Oh, thank you.
Your boss hasn't told you that lately.
She has, actually.
And Sarah, how about you?
Yeah, absolutely. I am a registered nurse and most recently a nurse practitioner with a specialty as a psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner, one of my most recent accomplishments in my field. I was originally starting in my RN field as a labor and delivery nurse. About 11 years ago, I shifted into forensic nursing. At that time, I was the coordinator of a community-based center where we served patients after sexual assault 24/7. And then 6 years ago, it was when I came into the Georgia statewide SANE coordinator position. And of course, a SANE is a forensic nurse, but SANE stands for Sexual Assault Nurse Examiners. And in this role, I oversee a lot of the technical assistance for programs that serve sexual assault patients. And in the human trafficking space, I also work to support some of the services that are offered from the state to victims of human trafficking.
Excellent. And you do a fantastic job as well, if your boss hasn't told you lately.
She has.
Excellent. Okay, so guys, Erica, we talk about this sometimes. When we're out in the general public and people find out what we do, they want to talk about human trafficking because it's a big issue. And I find, and I think you have indicated this as well, that sometimes people don't always even understand exactly what human trafficking is. So let's start really basic.
Yeah.
What is human trafficking?
Yeah. So human trafficking is defined as a crime that involves the exploitation of another person or persons through compelled labor or commercial sex with the use of force, fraud, or coercion. Of course, with the exception of an individual that is under the age of 18, only specific to sex trafficking. So when thinking about sex trafficking and trying to kind of break that down, there are a couple of different subsections of sex trafficking specific to minors. So we're thinking of DMST or CSEC. We have lots of acronyms in the field. DMST standing for domestic minor sex trafficking, and then CSEC standing for commercial sexual exploitation of children. Bit of a mouthful. The main difference between those two subsets of child trafficking is domestic minor sex trafficking, of course, is only going to refer to our minors here in the country, whereas CSEC a bit more encompassing, inclusive of all children that might be experiencing victimization through exploitation.
And you mentioned that you oversee the human trafficking unit, and we have in that human trafficking unit victim advocates.
Yeah.
Why is the advocacy component so essential to our state's human trafficking response?
Yeah. So I think oftentimes, right, we tend to get a bit siloed in the work, and we found that bringing advocates and kind of really expanding our reach within advocacy in the human trafficking unit really allowed us to kind of bridge the gap between law enforcement, prosecution, nonprofit organizations, victim serving providers. So we really felt like having dedicated team members in the unit that were boots on the ground, going out, assisting with victims in person allowed us to kind of break down some of those silos. We really felt like serving as that liaison, between state agencies and nonprofits allowed us to be better informed about what does trafficking really look like. So that could help to improve just the statewide response. It could help to inform policy, really just holistically make our statewide human trafficking response a bit broader, but also in a way a bit more niche as well, really diving in and helping to understand what is the landscape, what does the environment of trafficking look like.
Yeah, and shout out to Lindsay and Lainey, who are current advocates. We're looking to expand, so we'll have some new ones hopefully as well. They do a tremendous job in your unit also. And so you mentioned several other disciplines that our advocates work with, and one of those is medical providers. So Sarah, from your perspective as a medical provider, why is that advocacy partnership important in the human trafficking response?
Absolutely, because we do have this multidisciplinary team response that Erica spoke to. It is really important that we have people that have different specialties there to respond to the unique needs of a victim who has experienced human trafficking. We know now in the work that we do in the field, there's a lot of medical needs. The medical team, when we are responding, we stay within our role as nurses or providers to take care of the medical needs. But beyond the medical needs of these patients extends into these disciplines. The advocates are very important to have with us because they can respond to some of the other needs, the human response. They can also do some of the follow-up that the patients will need beyond the medical needs. So that team response with the different members coming and working within their roles brings this team to the total response to offer a total response to that victim.
Yeah, and so I think one of the things that we all do as human trafficking professionals or individuals that are responding to human trafficking is focus on that partnership. We're also getting out there. I know in today's session, our audience is going to be medical professionals, so we're going to get in a few minutes into more of the medical side of it. But we do a lot of education, as you've both mentioned. And part of that education, Erica, is addressing misconceptions and misperceptions that maybe the general public has, could be medical professionals even, could be our criminal justice professionals. So let's talk for a minute about those misperceptions. What are those?
Yeah, I think misconceptions and myths around trafficking have been around for a very long time. Unfortunately, and I think it's helpful in each of our roles to kind of help to debunk some of that, to help really shine some light on what does trafficking really look like? Who does it truly impact? And I think if we all have a better understanding and idea of that, then we may feel better equipped to identify and then handle it. So I know a large misconception, right, is that this crime is only happening in foreign countries, that it's not really impacting the United States, or that it's not really impacting us here in Georgia. I know another misconception that can be really damaging is that only young girls or women are victimized by human trafficking. And then also thinking about, when you come across individuals that you might suspect to be a victim, that they're going to be very eager and willing to accept help or assistance. And I think in each of our respective roles, we just know that that's usually not the case. And of course, we can talk a little bit more about the reasons for that. But I think also there are certain films, and then of course with social media, movie, television, music, it paints trafficking as this very overt violent crime. Also stranger danger, right? Somebody's gonna pick you up in a white van and snatch you off the street. More times than not, especially within our personal experiences and the clients and victims that we've worked with, we just know that that's not really the case. Not to say that it never happens, but more times than not, I think what we're seeing is that oftentimes the victim knows the trafficker. A lot of times they have some sort of relationship with that trafficker, and that relationship in their mind might be a little bit different than what it actually is in reality, but they're still seeing this person maybe as a trusted individual. And so, yeah, I think when those misconceptions and myths infiltrate our criminal justice response or even the general public, it does a real disservice to those folks that are actually impacted by the crime. It continues to keep them in the shadows. And so bringing some of those misconceptions forward and helping to demystify kind of the notion around trafficking, again, it allows us to better understand what this crime looks like, and then we feel better prepared, to help out those impacted by it.
So, needless to say, there's a lot of challenges associated with responding to human trafficking.
Yeah.
And starting at the very beginning of a response, one of those challenges is just the identification of a victim. So, Sarah, we know that approximately 90% of human trafficking victims nationally have been to a doctor or a medical provider in the year preceding their recovery. And getting out of that trafficking situation. So from a medical perspective, what can providers, nurses, doctors do to help identify human trafficking victims?
There are a lot of things that medical can do, but to piggyback on what Erica was mentioning for a minute, is some of those barriers for medical. Medical, we are very focused on the chief complaint. Why is this patient coming into our care today? Similar to the dynamics that Erica mentioned, that there can be family members or trusted members involved in the trafficking, we have very unique dynamics within that relationship. Some of them similar to what you may see with that attachment in domestic violence or intimate partner violence, where it really does confuse that patient interaction or have some other sort of bonding or commitment to that relationship that makes it very difficult for them to disclose to medical. So if a patient comes in and we don't have that as a chief complaint or not a known part of their history, unless there's something obvious, we're going to be focusing on what that chief complaint is. So the assessment is a very critical part of what nurses do. During assessments and obtaining the history for the purpose of guiding medical care, there are questions that we can ask. There are things that we can look for in our assessment that can raise a red flag or be potential indicators of trafficking.
And we're going to get into more of that in just a minute, right? We're going to talk more about that. You've both kind of touched on familial trafficking. So, Erica, can we dig a little deeper and talk to us about what is familial trafficking and what are we seeing in the field?
Sure. So familial trafficking is going to look like a family member, could be biological, could be foster, it could be whoever has custody or a relationship, familial relationship with that person, exploiting them for their own personal benefit. And just to kind of quickly back up just for a second, I think a lot of folks think that trafficking always has to be in exchange for money, right? But we know that that is not always the case. It can certainly be just something of value. So that could be, or, safety or a place to stay. I think when we kind of traditionally think about familial trafficking, what we oftentimes are seeing is parents or whoever has current custody of that child selling that child for commercial sex. And a lot of times that's going hand in hand with some substance use dependency. So thinking about parents maybe selling their child for sex to another individual because of that addiction is real, right? And folks are looking to really kind of find that next fix. And so unfortunately that's what we are seeing. But to be very fair, it's not always biological parents. Right. Thinking about aunt, uncle, grandma, grandpa. It could be anyone. And so there's a lot of challenges with familial trafficking. And again, that is, Georgia is not isolated or not exempt from familial trafficking. We have had several cases happen here in the state that we know and give us, a lot of evidence to believe that it's happening here just as much as anywhere else.
Well, and sometimes those cases may be misinterpreted as a sexual abuse case as opposed to a trafficking case. So it's really important, I think, also for our law enforcement and prosecutors to understand what familial trafficking is too. And we offer training on that around the state, and your team has done a tremendous job really getting the word out there. So make sure our professionals are educated. Sticking with familial trafficking for just 1 second, Sarah, you may have already addressed this, but is there anything else that you want to add just for the medical providers to understand about how to identify a familial trafficking victim?
In the medical setting, it might present where that support person might be speaking on behalf of the patient. That patient seems very uncomfortable with certain questions that might be asked. There might be threats that existed prior to coming in, that the patient feels that someone could be hurt or an animal pet could be hurt, or there might be an outcome that's negative to them. If there is any sort of engagement with the medical team, that could tip us that there is a potential situation here such as trafficking. So look for family members or that support person that are overbearing or speaking on behalf. One thing I've seen medical do across the state, they come up with ways to interview that patient alone or have a few minutes alone with that patient so that things can be exchanged outside of the presence of any support people. And that might be asking the support person to go get ice chips, or the patient's going to radiology for a test or a procedure. And that is also that opportunity that medical would ask them additional questions or do additional screenings if necessary.
And I think one time we even saw medical providers who had a little sign in the room where the patient may go to privately give a specimen, for example, a urine specimen, and they have a little sign, do you need help, or something like that. And so those are really creative ways, I think, that medical providers can, not only in human trafficking cases, but in domestic violence cases, for example, really get to the core of what's happening with their patients. So, yeah.
And to just kind of jump in on that piece as well, Sarah and I have talked about this many times that, for whatever reason, oftentimes patients feel comfortable to share things with medical providers that they don't necessarily share with other people. So being in a setting and given some space and some opportunity, I think, even if trafficker or a perpetrator is in that room with you or in that space with you, if that medical provider is able to find a creative way to separate those two parties, I think that there's, a good opportunity to have some disclosure there. And Sarah, I'd like, if you have thoughts on that. But I mean, I know when I'm at the doctor, I'm just dishing out everything. You're willing to share kind of some things that you would not normally maybe tell another person in your life.
Yeah, that is an excellent point. And in the setting of human trafficking, there is the opportunity for medical to establish that trusting relationship and rapport. And perhaps in this encounter, that patient might not disclose for whatever reason, threats, fear, but trust can be established. And as they continue to seek medical care, and we consistently present with a very trust relationship, empowering the patient, showing them that we care and that we are asking the questions and providing them that respectful environment to deliver this care, that sometimes can lead to that trust where disclosures feel safer to that victim.
And so one of the challenges of that, and that you have both also touched on this, is actual trauma bonding, right, with the trafficker. So what is that, Erica? What is trauma bonding?
Trauma bonding. It's complex. It's oftentimes where a victim, and this is not just exclusive to human trafficking, but thinking about victimizations kind of on a spectrum across the board, feels some sort of loyalty, relationship with their abuser, perpetrator, trafficker. And that could be for all sorts of different reasons. A lot of times traffickers are advantageous. They are looking to find what is the weakest link within an individual? What are their needs? How can I meet that individual's need so rapport can be built? So this person senses that I'm a safe and trusting individual, right? And so if you maybe don't have anywhere to sleep for the night, or if you have gone a day or two without having a hot meal and someone offers that to you, immediately you could think, this person's looking out for me. They're interested in what's best for me. And so even though that person might be an unsafe individual as a victim, if you're having those basic needs be met, things get a little complicated. So trauma bonding is looking like, I might have the cognitive understanding that something is happening to me, or someone is doing something to me, but I'm able to compartmentalize it. I'm able to also understand that there could be, kindness, that this person is also offered shelter, food, safety, etc. And so you're willing to make excuses for the perpetrator. You're willing to overlook some of that egregious behavior, that you might be experiencing or that you've witnessed yourself as a victim. And so it makes it very challenging thinking about the criminal justice system and why oftentimes human trafficking victims are labeled as combative or challenging. A lot of times it's because there is that sense that they are in a relationship with their trafficker. They very much see themselves as boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever. And I think that helping to really understand the nature of that relationship, the complexities of that relationship, better allows us to respond in a compassionate way. Trauma bonding it's challenging. It's different.
And oftentimes there are many situations in that victim's life that led up to the vulnerability that led to their exploitation. So can you talk a little bit about some of the vulnerabilities associated or the risk factors, I guess we would call it, that we often see with human trafficking victims? What leads them to that exploitation?
I think with vulnerabilities and risk factors, 70 to 90% of kids that have experienced sexual exploitation also have a history of child sexual abuse. And you think that's a really staggering number, but if you break that down a little bit, as a young person, if the idea of sex was introduced to you in a way where you were groomed and you were taught, for your silence, you may be given something. It's a transaction, right? It becomes transactional. If that was your first introduction or experience with some sort of sexual encounter, that's easily transferable to a sexually exploitive situation as well, because there's a transaction happening. You are doing something for somebody in order to maybe receive something else. I think some other vulnerabilities that we oftentimes see are family dysfunction. What's happening within the home? Are you experiencing or witnessing abuse within your own home? Looking to leave that situation and find yourself, maybe encountering or meeting up with an individual who is not a safe individual, but you're just trying to get out of kind of whatever's happening within the home. Oftentimes, I think, folks with disabilities are targeted simply just because, whether that be physical or cognitive disabilities, not really having the understanding or the ability to say no or to understand what's happening around you. I think those are some of the main ones that come to mind. I think that trafficking is indicative of a lot of different types of abuse. You have oftentimes the grooming, which we see a lot of times with traditional child abuse, and then of course within every sexual exploitive situation, that's always also going to be a case of sexual assault or sexual abuse. And then you have oftentimes domestic violence or intimate partner violence. If the victim believes that they are in a relationship with their trafficker, but there is abuse happening, that's not just a trafficking situation, but also becomes an intimate partner violence situation as
Right.
well.
And we talk a lot in our trainings about polyvictimization and adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, that are oftentimes present in the history of a human trafficking victim that led them to be vulnerable to recruitment.
Right.
So now you have an individual that has already had less than ideal circumstances in their lives, and then they are targeted by a human trafficker. Talk to us a little bit about those recruitment techniques that traffickers use.
It's interesting. I think recruitment techniques have evolved over time. I think social media plays a huge part in that, right? So, I grew up before the internet was a thing, and then but was alive but was alive when it became a thing, and even since the inception of the internet and social media. I always say traffickers, as bad as we hate to admit it, they're going to be savvy and they're going to try to find creative ways to reach victims. And so recruitment happens online. Recruitment can happen in person. It can happen where they're utilizing current victims to go out and search for potentially new victims, and that's what we call peer-to-peer recruitment. So you are utilizing a current victim because that individual, that young person or adult, could be more disarming. And if they approach a peer of theirs and they say, "I'm making all this money, and I've got this great lifestyle, and I've got this great place to stay," and whatever, that could be very appealing to another person that maybe doesn't have those things. And so a trafficker is going to maybe utilize some of those other opportunities to reach potential victims and kind of bring them in, maybe into the inner circle.
Yep, awesome. So I think we've talked a good bit with both of you about some of the dynamics of human trafficking. I think it's worth also mentioning that a lot of what we're talking about here today is specific to sex trafficking. And you mentioned in the beginning labor trafficking. Labor trafficking is also a big issue. And for today's purposes, we won't have time to really get into all of the labor trafficking dynamics, but I wanted to make sure that we mention that as well, that there's an effort also in the state to address labor trafficking. We have a labor trafficking task force, and we always want to make sure that our audiences are aware that labor trafficking is an issue in Georgia and nationally and across the world as well. But for now, Sarah, let's dig deeper into this medical response, because we've set the groundwork with what it is, what are the risk factors, what are the misperceptions, what are the vulnerabilities. If I'm a medical responder, a medical professional, and I suspect, based on everything I've learned here today, that I have a patient that may be a human trafficking victim, what do I do?
Great question. And this really gets into a lot of considerations for medical. Yes. Safety will always be first. Is there anything that we need to do as the medical team to ensure that we are going to be safe? Because you can imagine things could escalate very quickly, especially if that trafficker is nearby and suspects something is being discovered. Mm-hmm. So safety first, which means notification through your appropriate channels. What does that look like? Are you in an emergency room setting? Yeah. That might now be involving your security team, your chain of command, your charge nurses. So getting that structure in place to ensure that this is going to be a safe environment. Now within that safe environment gives us the opportunity to screen our patient. There are many different screening tools available to us in the medical community. If you go to the HHS government website, we do have screening tools that are designed to guide us in different clinical settings, dependent on the age of this patient and also the type of trafficking. One of those is a trafficking tool that we like to use a lot in forensic nursing, and it was actually developed by two of our providers here in the state of Georgia. One is a physician, Dr. Jordan Greenbaum, and the other one is also a medical provider, a doctorate nurse practitioner with extensive SANE training, Dr. Marnie Dodd. Yep. And they created an incredible tool that was meant for CSEC, and it breaks down several questions that you would ask in the screening, and it's a quick assessment or a quick screening tool meant for the CSEC population. However, if you look at the way you're asking questions and framing the questions, it allows for this safe encounter with the patient. It gives them full information about limitations of confidentiality and empowers them to understand what's going to happen with the information and then what happens next. However, one thing that's very important for all of us to know is that screening tools simply give us more information to help us know if additional referrals are needed or team members are brought in. They are not diagnostic of trafficking.
Right.
So we can start with screening tools. We also look at behavior and the interactions with the patient's behavior throughout our time with the patient. Verbal cues, statements that might be made that fall into some of those high risk or potential indicators. And of course, we've mentioned this already, physical assessment. There are things that we may see when we're doing our head to toe physical assessments that are highly suggestive of abuse that should raise the red flag.
Yeah.
And I know that we in the Human Trafficking Unit at CJCC have developed some more in-depth training. We're just scratching the surface here today. And we get a lot of requests to go around the state. Will you talk a little bit about what that training looks like? And I do want to make sure I state out loud that we do get a lot of requests for it, and we're always happy to try to accommodate those requests. We love it when people get a bigger group together so we can hit one area at a time. And so if any of our listeners or viewers today are interested in that, we love to make sure we have a big enough group to come to whatever part of the state it is. There's 159 counties in Georgia. We've been to all of them at one time or another, and we're happy to come if we can get a big enough group. And so I wanted to make sure I threw that out there before you answered the question about that training.
Okay, so we have a few different training curriculums that we've developed. Erica and I started with this several years ago and had a human trafficking training. It was about 2 hours that we would do for medical across the state. And it went over those dynamics, some of the things you've already heard us talk about, and then go in depth into the medical assessment, what those behavioral observations might look like, some of the verbal cues that you might hear from the patient, and then some of those red flags in physical assessment. What we learned was they wanted more. Medical wants more. Medical wants to understand how to identify and then what to do when they identify it. So that turned quickly into a 4-hour presentation.
Yeah, right.
And from that also, now we developed another 4-hour curriculum that is 100% medical that goes even more into the details and specific response in the medical space.
Yep, excellent. And a lot of times we'll come in and do a little bit in the morning, maybe take a lunch break. Sometimes some of our hospitals or other medical providers who are hosting the training will bring lunch in, and then we wrap up in the afternoon. So yeah, y'all have both done a tremendous job with that too. Is there anything else, Sarah, before we kind of conclude, that you would like to say about human trafficking, our response in Georgia, and that's specific to medical?
There are a couple things that I definitely would like to discuss before we end this. One is check our own biases. Bias is a whole other conversation, but we all have them.
Yep.
In my work with sex trafficking victims, especially the youth, we have seen patients that come in, and many times they have positive urine drug screens. They have positive sexually transmitted infection test results. They may seem combative or defiant. So stop, check our bias, and assess the patient and understand this is not about us. There's something going on deeper with the patient, with the youth that comes in that with that clinical presentation. If we take a minute just to try to understand and to establish rapport and give that patient space, we might be surprised what we find when we start to layer back. And these are coping mechanisms many times. And we need to take bias and judgment aside and try to find the root cause. And maybe it's not human trafficking, but we need to be open-minded to what we're seeing in these presentations and not just assume this is a difficult person. Yeah. Maybe they are, but we need to take the time to really find out what's going on.
Well said.
Absolutely.
Yes. And there's one other thing that I just feel like I have to say to medical is it is not our job to get a disclosure. We can't force a disclosure out of a patient. We do our best to get the information, to make referrals, and to involve other team members. But at the end of the day, we are medical professionals and our duty is still to the patient, and they're presenting needs and any of the things that are brought up during their care that need to be addressed are addressed, but we cannot force someone to leave a situation. And of course, right now I'm referring to the adult population. We do have mandated reporting laws here in Georgia, but in general, we stay in our lane and we're medical first and always, and we do not force disclosures.
I'm glad you said stay in your lane. We often talk about this in any kind of multidisciplinary, collaborative response. Know your role, know your lane, stay in it, but also know your partner's lane and know what they're supposed to do, and then lean on them and refer appropriately. So I'm really glad that you said that. We're going to talk in a minute about the statewide hotline, but before we do that, Erica, I wanted to give you the same opportunity. Is there anything that you would like to say?
Yeah, just kind of continuing with some of what Sarah was saying I think on the same, topic of staying in your lane. I think it's so important that we understand who our MDT partners are.
Right.
I don't think any of us were ever meant to do this alone. The work is a lot, it's heavy, right? And I think that's why it's so crucial to know the players, know the partners, really familiarize yourself within your community of, who is responding on behalf of law enforcement, medical, legal, victim advocacy, and have those sometimes hard conversations. Bring folks to the table to really try to figure out what can we do to better our holistic response as a whole. So even though we're staying in our own lanes, we're still familiarizing ourselves, like you said, Amy, with what everybody else is doing. That in a way keeps us accountable, right? And helps to keep others accountable as well. But again, and also just really vicarious trauma, right? And just checking in with yourself, taking care of yourself. This work is hard, it's heavy. And so taking care of those around you as well, and then making sure that you're checking in with yourself.
Well said. So Erica, a few years ago, we established a statewide hotline, and you were actually the one that came up with the letters that were associated with the hotline. It's for medical providers, it's for social workers, it's for law enforcement, it's also for the general public. We created it specifically to be a multi-purpose hotline for human trafficking. So tell us what it is and tell us more about it.
Yeah. So our statewide human trafficking hotline is 1-866-END-HTGA. So at any point, day or night, 24/7, 365, that number acts as a phone tree. So you are able to get connected with a responder, depending on your purpose for calling, for either sex, labor, children, or adults. So there are 6 extensions. Currently, CJCC, we are assisting and overseeing that response, and in many different ways, been helping our partners that do respond on that. But you are able to get connected with an organization or an agency for law enforcement, for child sex trafficking, for adult sex trafficking, for labor trafficking, for children's residential provider, as well as our national hotline. So as you mentioned, Amy, it can be the caller can be law enforcement, medical, the general public, but also primary victims themselves. So if you are in a dangerous situation and you are looking to get help, that number is available to you to call as well. And so, we are very, very proud of our statewide hotline.
Yes, we love our hotline. So Sarah, if I'm a ER nurse and I've been to your training and I have a patient that is exhibiting some of the indicators of trafficking, whether that be physical or behavioral, and I've looked at Dr. Dodd or Dr. Jordan Greenbaum's screening tool, and I've determined that I may have a human trafficking victim on my hand. I can use that hotline. Is that right?
Absolutely, yes.
And so again, it's 866-END-HTGA, and that stands for End Human Trafficking Georgia. Yeah. Thank you both. This was fun to sit down and talk about human trafficking with both of you. I really appreciate you guys doing this with me today.
Thank you for having us. Yes. It's been a pleasure.
Yes, absolutely.